This is our first attempt at a webinar, so take it easy on us here. But it should be fun. It's definitely a topic that that we love and we've been working on for a long time, and it's great to finally be able to have some wines and explain what our motivations and process have been. I think I'll just go ahead and start and maybe back up. And in the course of building Aeris, one of the most fundamental and most interesting parts of what we've done is to try and figure out the sites. The sites that can produce really distinctive and great Pinot Noir that offer a unique expression in wine. And in the course of doing that, obviously we become very impassioned by that idea, but there are other grapes that we're also passionate about. And one was Nebbiolo. And Nebbiolo was a real conundrum because unlike Pinot, which had been demonstrated to be successful in the New World, there were fewer examples of that with Nebbiolo. So very haphazardly, basically just because we love the grape, we planted some at Horseshoe Vineyard, must have been about 15 years ago. And unlike our Pinot projects, this was not something that was very well researched. And if anything, it was pretty haphazard. And we got the results that we deserved. It turns out Horseshoe is much too cool of a climate for Nebbiolo. And the grapes didn't ripen. I once told somebody, well, the grapes didn't ripen, and they kind of didn't believe that because they view California as so warm. And they said, what do you mean they didn't ripen? I said, well, they didn't turn red. So we're obviously in much too cool of a microclimate. And back then there was a real dearth of information about what were the climatic requirements for Nebbiolo. In fact, even on the internet, unless our Italian was weak, it was maybe hard to Google it. But even there, it was almost no macroclimate characterization, which you can find for Pinot very easily. So what we did next is step back and say, okay, that haphazard approach obviously didn't yield anything we'd be interested in. We need to start up from a complete grounds up approach and ask the questions just like we did with Pinot. First and foremost, what does Nebbiolo, great Nebbiolo, require? And why has it been unsuccessful in the New World? And then try and solve those problems from the bottoms up. So the first thing we did is find a great viticulturalist in Piemonte, which is Gian Piero Romana. And Gian Piero actually had weather stations in Barolo, and he could give us the climatic information that we needed. In particular, what you want to see is monthly high average temperatures, monthly low average temperatures, and monthly mean average temperatures. There's many other aspects of climate, but those are kind of the macro parameters you really have to get right to grow a grape properly. What was interesting about that was the amount of misconceptions that people have about Nebbiolo. A lot of people know Nebbia means fog in Italian and think of it as a cooler climate. It's actually a very warm climate. So Nebbiolo is a grape that requires a great deal of warmth through the season. Whenever you use English words to characterize climate, it's difficult because they're not as exact. And when we say warm, what do we mean warm? Well, it doesn't mean necessarily that it gets to 110 degrees for many days. It means that the average temperature through the season is basically in math, the integral under that curve is pretty large. In fact, up there with Grenache. What's different though, about the climate in Piemonte is the diurnal between the high and the low, the nighttime low temperature and the daily high temperature. That differential is very low, and in fact, it's only 17 degrees Fahrenheit. And I think therein lies the key to why Nebbiolo hasn't been more successful outside of Italy. A lot of people's first reaction is Nebbiolo hasn't been successful in Italy because everywhere else doesn't have the marl that Barolo and Barbaresco do. Well, the counterexample is nearby in Gattinara. Gattinara is a Nebbiolo region grown on schist and had more esteem than Nebbiolo until the last several decades. So soil, it is still a great soil. If you look at all the soils in the world that grow great wine, they're typically going to have a great clay topsoil, which means you have to have a geology that erodes to create that clay. And obviously limestone does that, but so does schist. So you'll see that is a common theme. In any case, back to the climate, in thinking about that small diurnal, it's very rare actually to find something like that in the New World. Typically especially where there's low humidity, valley floors have very cold nights and very hot days. A great example of that would be Paso Robles, where there can be a 60-degree Fahrenheit swing in a day. And what happens when you have the difference between these really large diurnals and the small diurnals is the grape's metabolism and the way it ripens can be changed. For example, a warmer night tends to burn off some of the acid. If you have too hot a day, it can burn off some of the complexity and create more raisin flavors. So it's really important to map that curve. So in trying to do that, we used all of the weather station information that we had throughout all of our Reese Vineyards sites, and realized that what we needed was altitude, because in California's coastal range, there's a very interesting effect at night where the cold air sinks into the valleys and pushes up the warm air. So if you're at altitude, you actually have a warmer night than the valley floor, a much warmer night. Now, at the same time, as the temperatures rise throughout the day, the altitude helps hold that down. So by looking at altitude and the right distance from the ocean, we were able to find a climate that matches Piemonte almost perfectly, a little bit skewed maybe 1 week later, but very closely. And that began our major Nebbiolo project. Now, there's another story in parallel that I need to back up a little bit, which is around Carricante. And in visiting Italy in the early, what do we call them, the aughts, the 2001 or something like that, I was just, always fascinated by wine and asking to try some indigenous varieties. Italy has over 3,000 grape varieties and for wine. And in tasting through, I met an interesting guy who took me to a wine shop, and he said, let's try a bunch of these different wines. And we tried a lot of whites. And to be honest, I'm not a huge fan of Italian white wine, or many of them. But in going through this lineup, I hit a wine that just blew my mind. And it was a wine called Benanti Pietramarina. And it was grown on the eastern slope of the Mount Etna volcano, and made from a grape called Carricante, which I'd never heard of before. And that wine just had everything that truly great white wines have. It had depth, length, it had layers of complexity. Every time you taste it, you find something new. It had precision, it had a great spine, energy, and I was enthralled. So years passed by, and showed the wine to Jeff, and I think he was equally fascinated with it, and ended up thinking, wow, here could be a white wine grown in a warmer climate, which would have all this great soil reflection and great character, which would fit many of California's best soils better, say, than Chardonnay, because some of these sites are too warm for a great Chardonnay. So I began Googling about the grape and how the wine was made, and ended up finding Salvo Foti, who was the winemaker of that wine, and corresponded with Salvo. And I think at first he thought we were probably kind of quacks, and ultimately, though, agreed to meet with us, and we went to visit and learn more about Carricante. And in doing that, I told Salvo I'm really interested in this grape, and learned Salvo is the savior of the indigenous varieties of Mount Etna, so his knowledge is immense. And in talking to Salvo about bringing the grape and growing it in California, which he sort of reluctantly agreed to do, I learned many things about Caracante that were fascinating. One is that there's almost none of it. He estimated at the time there was only about 10 acres of pure Caracante on Mount Etna. And predominantly it was grown on the eastern slope, which is the cooler part. I don't know, Jeff, do you have
Yeah, give me a second. I just real quickly though, I wanted to interject and say that we didn't really lay out the ground rules, but what we'd like to do is, while Kevin's discussing the project, we'd like to go ahead and take questions. In the lower part of the screen, there's a Q&A button. If you click that, you can submit a question, and we're going to collate those. And then Kevin and I are going to go through those questions a little bit later on. So if something comes to mind, if you have a question, just go ahead and jot it in that Q&A section, and we'll get to it in a bit.
Yes, after this not so brief introduction. But Jeff, do you have a picture of the volcano?
Yeah, of course.
Let's see. What's interesting about Mount Etna, maybe is that the one that shows the cloud shadow?
Yeah, that's taken from the air, flying in. That's looking from the east across the volcano.
Okay. Well, there is the eastern slope is actually the coolest part of the volcano for a strange reason, that Mount Etna kind of creates its own climate, and it creates this cloud shadow that the wind typically blows across to the east. And the northern slope, that eastern slope is considered the best place to grow white wine, and the northern slope is considered the best place to grow red wine, Morella Mascalese. So in talking more to Salvo about this Caracante and learning that there was so little, it blew my mind that there wasn't more of it and that it wasn't more well known. And that's the genesis of the Aeris Sicily proportion. We're portion of the project. We were always interested in growing grapes in California, and had not really considered having a Sicilian portion, but Salvo kind of talked us into it. And he's thought the most ideal site for Caracante in the perfect spot of Milo. And we purchased the property, and he took half and we took half. And that's the genesis of our Caracante in Sicily. Meanwhile, a couple years later, we purchased some 100 or who knows how old mixed red grape vineyard, mostly Morella Mascalese, on the northern slope. These are very small vineyards, but things that we think it's really fun to offer, and it really enhanced our learning. We obviously put up weather stations, as we are prone to do, and got some pretty specific knowledge of the climate that these grapes required. And we even then began the process of getting Caracante and Morella Mascalese through the California UC Davis Foundation Plant Services. And we were successful after 2 or 3 years of working with that. So that's kind of a quick, maybe not so quick intro. We could talk a lot about how we planted the vines, how we've grown them. We have some pictures other than me might be useful at this point. And we can field some questions as well. Jeff, maybe let's go to the vineyard.
You want to go Centennial?
Yeah, we'll give an overview of the site.
Sounds good.
I see one on the right about 3 rows down. Oh, there you go. That'll work too.
There we go. You see that?
So Centennial Mountain Vineyard is about 18 to 1900 feet in elevation, about 12 miles from the Pacific Ocean, a few miles to the west of Lake Sonoma. And we planted 25 acres there. We planted about 11 acres of Nebbiolo, and I'm not sure this is working, Jeff, with the picture. Maybe we'll jump to the vine pictures.
Sure.
We planted 11 acres of Nebbiolo and learned a lot from John Pierre Romana about how to grow Nebbiolo. It's fascinating how the way you grow and prune Nebbiolo is very unique, because the first 3 or 4 buds on the vine are sterile and will not create grapes. So if you see the grapevines, they'll be trained lower with the intention that there will be 3 or 4 buds before they hit the wire, because those are non-producing buds anyway. And also this is when these vines were young, or it's this year when they're barely growing yet, but the trellis is very high. So Nebbiolo requires a lot of foliar coverage in order to ripen the grapes. And this is the predominant way that all vineyards in Barolo and Barbaresco are planted these days for both Barbera and Nebbiolo. Jeff, maybe click to you got a good Albarello example there.
Absolutely.
So for the Sicilian varieties, we decided to plant using the method that they employ, which is not a goblet training, it's a stake training. The difference between goblet and stake is there are several different ones, but one is it allows for tighter spacing. They generally are spaced about 4 foot by 4 foot. There's a Roman pattern called quincunx, which they've used for thousands of years there. And that head training is very important for Nerello Mascalese. Salvo explained to us, because the better quality grapes are made closer to the stalk. And so it's not a great grape for putting on a trellis, and you really get higher quality. And sort of like Zinfandel, you get better yield control with this sort of a pruning methodology. So Caracante and Nerello Mascalese are planted that way. So it's an interesting way to grow a white grape. We're so used to Chardonnay on a trellis, but how we have a stake trained white grape Caracante. There it is. What's interesting about Caracante, there's so many misconceptions, because since our discovery of Caracante, the rest of the world has discovered Caracante as well. And there's great demand for Caracante on Sicily. In fact, the grape price is now above red, which is pretty mind-boggling, really. And unfortunately, what that means is that a lot of non-Caracante white wine gets labeled as Caracante, or its very small percentage of Caracante gets emphasized. Caracante is very distinctive in what I consider a truly great white wine grape, while the majority of the grapes on Etna, white grapes, are going to be Cotterado and Minella, which are table grapes and not great. They don't make a great white wine. They make an okay white wine. But Caracante I view as much more noble and shocking there's so little of it. But now there's many new plantings. In fact, I used to say there's really only 2 bottlings of 100% Caracante that I knew of. I think now there's at least 5 or 6, and probably many more coming if there's demand. Etna will react to that. Maybe one last thing, Jeff, we'll talk a little bit about winemaking and show maybe some of our casks, and
Sure.
That's a project we've been working on. In fact, I'll let you want to do some talking, Jeff?
Sure. Yeah, so one thing that we decided pretty early on is that we couldn't make any of these wines like Pinot Noir. And that's always your first idea, is you kind of go with what you know. And we did a little bit of that early, and it really didn't work. And so we kind of went back to the tradition, and that's really using wood. It's using wood fermenters. It's using large oak casks. And after surveying what was done in the old world, we kind of came back and designed a system that was going to work for us. And so the picture that you have here is our standard fermentation tank for the Aeris wine. So this is a 2-ton oak upright. It is temperature controllable. It has a jacket on the inside. You can see there's a lid up here at the top, so it's sealable. And so that we can do standard open fermentations We can also do submerged cap fermentations where we put a screen in here and hold it down. And the thing that we've been really sort of zeroing in on fermentation-wise is the length of fermentation. You know, Pinot Noir for us is something that's about 3 weeks in tank total, but we really don't have anything in the Aeris brand that follows that. The Nebbiolos are really more like 30 days, and things like the Nerello Mascalese are incredibly fast. We get those kicked off immediately, and they go 6 to 10 days, really maximum. And these are all things that are traditional, but they're traditional for a reason. And Nerello can be very tannic, so it's quick off the skins. Nebbiolo really needs that time to bring in a lot of the depth and the complexity, so that 30 days has been something of a sweet spot. We've experimented with shorter and we've experimented with longer out to 60 days, but we find that the 30 days is really a good spot for us. So, and then the other big component here is really the casks. And let me pull a good shot here. You know, we aren't doing really any barrel treatment of any of these wines. We're using almost exclusively 25 hectoliter and 10 hectoliter cask. 25 hectoliters about 11 normal barrels, and 10 hectoliters about 4 and change barrels. And these casks really give a different character. They don't have the oak impact, but they really provide us kind of a slow, gentle aging. And it really allows us to kind of pinpoint when the wines are ready to be bottled. And that's something that's really, if you go to, you know, Barolo and Barbaresco, and then up north in Gattinara and Gamay, these are really traditional. And it's the same down south. You know, Salvo uses a tremendous amount of wood in his program, both for Caricante and for Nebbiolo. Nebbiolo is fermented in the 2 tons, and then it goes into these casks, whereas Caricante is actually fermented directly in these casks. I have one here. And it spends its whole life there before bottling. Let's see here. Let's see. So here you can see a typical Aeris cask. And then from there, it's really it's really.
One other difference, Jeff, to mention on the Caricante is, so in France with white Burgundy, there's often a technique called batonnage used to stir the lees, and it helps with a more tight and acidic Chardonnay, really helps add flesh and richness and depth. Given California's generosity in those ways, we don't do any batonnage with California Chardonnay. But interestingly, with the Caricante, we do. We've tried it with and without, and it's just a dramatic difference. And Salvo does the batonnage in the casks as Caricante is fermenting and aging.
Here's a view here too. You can see how we've sort of dialed it on this cask. We have an entire wall now, and this is what we're using almost exclusively. But really the point is that it's a completely different kind of winemaking. It's like trying to make sparkling wine. You kind of have to go back to the beginning, start all over, ask all the same questions all over again. And that's been the big push in the winery the last few years.
Maybe speaking of questions, we should take a few. Justin Singh asks, how would you characterize the difference in taste profiles between our Caricantes in Italy versus California? I think the answer is that is still somewhat a moving target, because we're learning. Caricante is a very interesting grape. We have never seen a white grape that changes so much or in the same way over the first year in bottle. So when you're bottling Caricante, it's kind of like fromage blanc. I mean, it's just this white wine. It's sort of generic, great acidity always, but with a year in bottle, it goes through this metamorphosis and transformation, and you get these layers, and you start to get some of the fusel oil smells. Like I guess only Caricante and Riesling have that on the nose. Salvo said that's a chemistry breakdown that they did once. So ours are still young, and we did wait. I mean, we bottled this Bianco that we're going to offer tomorrow over a year ago to make sure we get that and it developed it. It really did. In fact, honestly, we kind of underestimated the wine. I think it's gotten better and better every month. I think the difference between the two, I think that the Centennial Mountain is more floral and more kind of a white flower, honeysuckle kind of a character compared to more of a beeswax in the Sicilian. I don't know, Jeff, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I completely agree. We really struggled early on because tasting it in barrel, we didn't know what it was supposed to taste like, but it didn't taste like the Caricante we tasted in bottle. And that was real difficult to get through. And even when we put it in bottle initially, like Kevin said, it didn't show those characteristics. And it's only after a year and it's really kicking in now. I think that's a good description. I think probably the difference in soil really accounts for the differences. And it is very much a more floral and maybe citrus peel. It doesn't have that really intense beeswax character that we see a lot in the Etna Bianco Superiore. Yeah, I think that's right.
Now next year we'll have both the Caricante Designate and the Bianco. We always want the Aeris is going to have some very affordable wines, at least affordable relative to what it costs us to make them. But the vineyard, the varietal designates, we decided to wait until 2018. We weren't clear on that at first because it wasn't until we saw how great 2018 was as a vintage, and that's just across the board, Pinot, Chardonnay, everything. We knew we had kind of one chance to make a first impression with people, and we want those first varietal designates to really wow customers. So we decided to wait but we did want to offer 2017 with the Bianco and the Bricco Rosso so people can see the direction. These are going to be our more affordable wines, and hopefully people enjoy the progress as well.
It's a good second question there by Michael about biodynamics and vineyard approach.
Yes. So I would not decry, Salvo is very strictly organic and minimal input, which is basically really good traditional viticulture. He's not biodynamic in the technical sense of biodynamics. We have been technically biodynamic in the past in our Pinot and Chardonnay vineyards. But our viticulture at this point would be almost identical to Salvo's, meaning minimal input, very organic. In fact, we do many of the things that Salvo recommended. Growing every grape is different, and you'll learn a lot. And he's been here, visited our vines, and give us some good ideas.
Yeah, I think that's a good point too. You know, Salvo's been out several times assessing the site and really helping not only the design and the layout, but also the viticulture there. And we've taken a lot from Salvo and then adapted it to the specific conditions of California. And I think that's important too. You know, we can't replicate what he does there, but we can learn from what he does and try to adapt it as best we can. But I think Kevin's point of minimal input is probably the best way to describe it. Do nothing that you don't need to do.
Here, another good question. Also curious about the Nebbiolo in the U.S. compared to the Langhe, Gattinara, and Valtellina. What I would answer, well, here's an interesting anecdote that might answer the question. We once brought our first Nebbiolo, which will not be released, but to Roberto Conterno, and he took one smell and said Gattinara, which I thought was amazing because he had no idea what soils we had grown the grapes on. Nor did we know about his Nervi project. So we obviously been studying Gattinara at the time. But that is probably it's not really the US versus Italy. I would say our site compared to Italy, the biggest resemblance is going to be with Gattinara, which can be a very great wine. I went to lunch a few months ago with a wine writer named Matt Kramer, and he brought an early 70s Gattinara, which was just mind-boggling. It's as good as any Barolo I've ever had. But there's a key difference in the Nebbiolos that are grown on schist versus limestone. Limestone imparts those big tannins that you think of and Barolo. And you'll find a more subdued tannic structure, or a lighter tannic structure in Gattinara. It still has many of Nebbiolo's characteristics, but it won't require 20 years before you can drink it. And that's probably a good thing, because when you think about why Nebbiolo hasn't been successful in the new world, I think only part of the answer is in sight. Part of the answer is in business. And trying to sell a wine that takes 20 years to come around is a new wine, is not an easy task. So obviously these aren't going to be sort of like, easy, ready to go right out of the gate Nebbiolos either. They're going to be great, structured Nebbiolos. They're going to age really well. But we are thinking of our Rosso as filling that earlier drinking slot in our lineup. But still something with a lot of site character, a lot of complexity.
I think one of the interesting things we've learned too or that we're still working on, is how long to actually age these in cask. And, we're certainly not going to be doing the 7-year, Monfortino approach, but it really does seem like 2 years is probably what they need to really get through the tannins and have something that's actually approachable. So that's one of the more interesting things that's still going on, is dialing in how much time in cask really gives us exactly what we need. And that's something that's going to be 100% tied back to the site. That's not something that we can borrow from Italy. We have to learn that on our own.
Tegan passed the
line. Oh, Tegan. Hey, Tegan.
We better be careful and answer this like we know what we're doing.
You never know who's watching.
Do you see any difference in growth or development in the vine? Yes, I think probably the main thing is that there's just a lot more water availability in the soil through the growing season in Italy. Nebbiolo is pretty thirsty that way. So I think that would be the biggest. As far as cluster sizes, we have smaller berry sizes here. I think it's because our soil's rockier, maybe back to the same thing about water availability. Smaller berry sizes here. Nebbiolo looks more similar. Nebbiolo, the key thing in viticulture is yield control, and we do a tremendous amount, just as all the best producers, really 4 to 6 clusters per vine. You've got to stay in that range to make a great Nebbiolo.
I think the bummer is all the challenges of those grapes came over the ocean too. I mean, the challenges in Nebbiolo are the same here as they have there, and the same with Caricante. With the issues with non-producing buds on Nebbiolo, that's something we were curious about, and it turns out it's true here as well.
Someone's asked about oak. Jeff, you want to answer that?
Oh, yeah, the oak, we've tried a couple of different things, but what we're using here, I'll pull up a picture while I'm talking. What we're using is produced in France, actually made in Burgundy. This particular barrel here is made by Rousseau. They're up in Gevrey-Chambertin. And we've experimented with several different kinds of oak. But what we like about them is they're very custom. And so these are built quite custom for us. And this architecture that you see with the stainless base is something that they developed for us to move them. And the wines that we've put through here, we've been really, really happy with. So we started with an Austrian producer and we moved away from them as the quality control seemed to slip. But Rousseau here has been making some really fantastic stuff for us. And they also make the 2-ton wood fermenters as well. So all of those are being made in the same house. And it's a great custom program that we have that's getting us exactly what we want. But as far as barrique goes, there's no new barrique usage. They're only used as a holding vessel before things go into cask. But everything else is done in cask.
Gosh, John Preston said the Aeris wine so far been superb. Thank you, John. The best is yet to come. We've got a lot of stuff we're really excited about in the pipeline. Here's a great question. So this is a knowledgeable crowd. We got to be careful now, Jeff.
You're on your own.
How has your thinking about natural winemaking practices developed over the course of the experiment and collaboration with Salvo Foti? So touching upon very acutely, or what's the word, with high acuity, touching on an area where we might differ from Salo. So our view of great wine is wine that's grown completely organically, minimal inputs, high care, and minimal manipulation. But where we would diverge from the natural wine movement is we like to have enough sulfur to preserve the wine and have it age well in bottle, and that that has been a discussion, but one that we've resolved. We sulfur might get maligned in some quarters, but honestly, I mean, what good does it make to make a great white wine with all this distinctive terroir? You don't add enough sulfur and it tastes like applesauce, and everything's now masked. Everything's masked by oxidative character. I might get myself in trouble saying that, but that's how I truly feel, and you tuned in. So that would be my answer.
That's a good answer. Ian, with the hard-hitting questions.
We've been asked about aging. Well, we expect the wines to age phenomenally well in bottle. I think the Bianco will age well from what we've seen. Obviously, the ones that we're not expecting as people to have for 10 to 20 years or more, the Bianco and maybe the Rosso, but honestly, I'm sure the Rosso will age well for 10 years, and the Bianco might as well. Carcanti ages quite well. It's a lot like Chardonnay in its aging curve, and in fact requires it. So our 2016 at Bianco Superiore that we're releasing tomorrow has been in a fairly tight phase until it's just starting to loosen up a bit, and it'll take another year or two for people to be able to see just how great that wine is. So there can be a requirement at the high end for aging with Carcanti. Obviously, we think our Bianco is going to be more approachable.
That's another good question for me in there about future collaborations.
They're really fun. We're in the midst of a lot of them. We have a great sparkling wine collaboration as well with Rudolph Peters, and we're learning so much, and it's fascinating. We're learning things that are helping us make the wines that we've traditionally made better. So, for example, what we learned about sparkling wine production has helped us make better Chardonnay. There's a lot of benefit. And there's a human side that's a lot of fun. It can be challenging too. We all have, as you touched on, philosophical differences and things like that. And but resolving that and creating our product that we believe in, but learning as much as we can. Those are our goals.
Yeah, I think his point about climate change and what you said earlier, Kevin, about the idea of as perhaps it gets warmer, the varieties that we currently have are not the best suited for these changing sites. And I think Ian makes a good point about that. At Carcanti exceeds in these warm climates. It could be the next thing for warm climates in California. And the only way you would discover that is through these collaborations, honestly.
It's been a motivator, maybe not the primary motivator, but one that we've thought about all along. I mean, current warming projections, in 40 to 50 years, we may not be able to grow Pinot in some of our Pinot sites, and Nebbiolo would probably be a fit. Carcanti could replace Chardonnay. I think these are very important grapes for California in the long run.
Yeah, we've talked about it a lot. Carcanti could be amazing in some place like Lodi. It may thrive in a spot like that. So we'd love to see it tried in some of those warmer places as well.
Nikki Rowe asked, where's the winery? So we didn't actually cover that, but part of Aeris is we built a whole new winery. The winery's in Ukiah, and we now make Reese wines both in Ukiah and in the Santa Cruz Mountains, and we make the Aeris wines entirely in Ukiah. That winery was built with Aeris and sparkling production and Pinot and Chardonnay in mind.
Mm-hmm. How old are the vines, Carcanti and Nebbiolo?
what are we, 2020 right now?
Yeah. So
6 to 8 years.
yeah,
6 to 8 years now.
it was a lot of that went in 2013, if I remember.
You know, we've covered all this background, and here's someone that's interested in what wines are actually going to be released tomorrow. Pretty reasonable question. We're going to release 3 wines tomorrow. So we have our one Sicilian Carricante, Etna Bianco Superiore, grown in the key place, which is, as Sal would say, above the church in Milo. It's cooler up there. It's an elevation thing. Etna is very gradated on the altitude, so this is a truly great Carricante. I would tell anyone, try this wine. If you don't like it, then just step away from Carricante, because it's got everything that makes the wine great. Ian DeGata said it was one of the white wines of the vintage for Italy or something like that. We think it's a truly great wine. We've had it here for 18 months, so we've had plenty of bottles ourselves. The 2 Aeris wines from Centennial Mountain are the Bricco Rosso and the Bianco. So the Bianco is 100% Carricante. We wanted to wait till 2018 to release a Carricante vineyard designate, but as I said, I think I think we underestimated the wine a little bit. I think it's a delicious Carricante, and you can see the difference between Sonoma and Sicily in that wine. The Bricco Rosso has been a lot of fun, and this is something that we're really going to be focused on. Obviously, we want to make a great Nebbiolo. It's job one. Nerello Mascalese has been a huge upside surprise for us, but the Bricco Rosso, we're kind of using a different muscle. We're sort of the anti-blenders with no 2 varietals shall ever meet kind of thing. But with the Bricco Rosso, the idea is to make a red wine that's very expressive of the site, because Centennial Mountain is this great piece of rocky mountaintop, and it has a lot to say. But what we want to do is not quite have the same aging curve of Nebbiolo, which is going to take longer, or even Nerello Mascalese to some extent. So by blending with some that's called Nerello Cappuccio on Etna, sometimes Carignan here, or a little Barbera, or a little Primitivo, or even a little Zinfandel, we can create a structure that is just delicious, and has some of the greatness of Nebbiolo, but different, definitely more approachable. So those 3 wines will be released tomorrow. Here's Jeff Felipe with a great question of clarification. Hasn't the 2016 Etna Bianco been offered before? No, it hasn't. So what happened was we offered the 2015, and Ian's question touched on the issue. We decided not to release the 2015, and the 2016 was so much of a better wine. We used that to fill those orders. So there's some 2016 that we shipped over the winter. And it's a replacement for the 2015. So hopefully no one minded. It's a much better wine. They got a great upgrade there. But the 2015, what we found, and it kind of gets back to this natural wine thing, there was just too much bottle to bottle variation that we just weren't comfortable with it. If people drink a lot of natural wine, they'd be totally comfortable with it, but we know our customers, some of them would say, hey, wait a second, and so we decided not to release that wine, and the 2016, that issue is completely resolved, and we are fully making the wine as the Pietra Marinas were made 20 years ago, and those have aged magnificently.
There we go.
All right, well, have we worked through any more questions? Would anyone like to, is there anything we didn't cover, Jeff?
I don't think so. I mean, I think we covered both sides of the project.
We could just say what's coming. So while we release just the 3 wines this year, next year, we will have several more. It'll be the first year with the 2018 vintage. We'll have Nebbiolo, Morello Mascalese. We'll have another Bricco Rosso. We made a small bottling of Barbera just because the quality was so high. I don't know how often we'll do that. That's it, right, Jeff? Did I miss anything?
Yeah, and then Caracas San Bianco. Yeah. We're really excited about those 18s. I think it's really the first, real good look at the single variety wines, and it's a great vintage to launch the single variety wines on. And I think even the Rosso is overperforming in 18. So we're really excited about that whole lineup. I think it's going to be really exciting for a lot of people.
Here's another good question. What are the prices? The Bianco is $35, including shipping. The Bricco Rosso is $49, and the Etna Bianco Superiore is $59. Any last questions? Going, gone. Well, we would like to thank everybody for showing up. Great participation, great questions, and if you have any more, just send them our way. And this is a fun format, so hopefully it's useful for customers. I guess we'll find out, and we can expand it in the future. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.